me, it's what it's about. Again, my family for years has been helping other families. And I mean, we love what we do. We love working together. We really do.
For nearly 2 decades, Mike Holmes has been one of the most recognizable faces on HGTV. To millions of viewers, Holmes was the contractor you wanted because he wasn't afraid to expose shortcuts and call out bad construction projects with his no-nonsense attitude. He made a successful career out of fixing disasters left behind by careless builders. But while Mike was busy repairing other people's homes, his own life was falling apart behind the scenes. Behind his tough personality and the iconic "make it right" mantra, the reality star was dealing with financial pressure, health scares, and professional feuds that never made it on camera. This is the tragedy of one of HGTV's biggest stars. The early days. Before he became a reality star, Mike Holmes was a working contractor with no interest in becoming famous. He wasn't even trying to gain recognition for his work, because all he wanted to do was fix other people's mistakes, something that has always been a part of his brand. He was taking on failed renovations, beefing with unlicensed contractors, and trying to salvage DIY jobs that had gone dangerously wrong. That was his bread and butter, but also his passion. By the late 1990s, that kind of work made up a large part of Holmes's livelihood. He routinely walked into homes where families had drained their savings only to be left with unsafe wiring, structural damage, and no one to hold accountable. It was work that paid the bills, but it also left a mark. Holmes has admitted that contracting was financially volatile, and during this period, overextension and business pressures eventually caught up with him. Before his television career ever began, Mike Holmes filed for personal bankruptcy. It's a detail that he doesn't talk about very often, but it's one of the most important chapters of his life. The bankruptcy came from the same high-risk construction world that he would later warn his viewers about. During the late 1980s and 1990s, Holmes was running his own construction business, taking on large projects that required high upfront costs. Like many contractors, he relied on credit, loans, and delayed payments to keep jobs moving. When projects stalled, clients failed to pay on time, or costs ran over budget, and all of that added up quicker than he realized. At the same time, Holmes has acknowledged that he trusted people he shouldn't have, business partners, clients, and systems that left him exposed when things went wrong. Without the financial buffer that larger construction firms had, one bad stretch was enough to bring everything down. Eventually, the debt became unmanageable, and bankruptcy was the only way out. It's true that the reality star eventually made it out, but it didn't happen overnight. Holmes rebuilt from that failure quietly, returning to work with a sharper focus on risk, accountability, and doing things by the book. That experience fundamentally shaped the way he approached both business and construction moving forward. From that point on, Holmes became obsessive about doing things by the book. Permits, inspections, proper materials, and documented work. He understood firsthand how quickly a poorly run job could destroy someone financially, because it had already happened to him. That frustration, professional, financial, and personal, is what set the stage for his accidental break into television. While working as a contractor on the set of a Canadian DIY renovation show, Holmes openly criticized the premise. Watching television personalities encourage inexperienced homeowners to tackle major renovations themselves rubbed him the wrong way. He argued that encouraging inexperienced homeowners to take on major renovations was irresponsible and often dangerous. According to those involved, he bluntly told the production team they were setting people up for failure and creating future repair jobs for contractors like him. That was definitely a risky move. But Holmes caught the producer's attention. This was a man who clearly cared about his work. Producers recognized that his bluntness wasn't an act. He wasn't trying to be entertaining. He was speaking from experience. That honesty sparked a new idea, a show focused not on renovations, but on exposing what happens when they go wrong. In 2001, Holmes on Holmes premiered in Canada. The format was straightforward. Holmes entered homes with botched renovations, tore open walls, and explained exactly what had failed. Code violations, structural shortcuts, hidden mold, unsafe wiring. There were no rushed timelines and no illusions that repairs would be cheap. More often than not, Holmes told homeowners that fixing the damage properly would cost far more than they expected. That honesty became the show's defining feature. As its popularity grew, Holmes on Holmes crossed over to HGTV in the United States, where Holmes's message resonated with an even wider audience. Viewers trusted him because he didn't soften the truth. Bad construction wasn't just cosmetic, it was dangerous. "Make it right" became Holmes's catchphrase, but it wasn't marketing at first. It was a principle forged through failure. He believed contractors should be licensed, work should meet code, and someone should be held responsible when things go wrong. Beliefs shaped by a career that had already shown him the consequences when they weren't. Mike Holmes didn't chase fame. He earned it by saying what others wouldn't. But as his reputation as television's most trusted contractor grew, the very principles that made him trusted on television would soon collide with realities off-camera that were far harder to repair. Mike Holmes's reality TV legacy. While most other shows on HGTV sold inspiration, Holmes was selling caution, and that made him believable. As ratings grew, so did demand for more content. Holmes expanded his presence with additional series, including Holmes Inspection, Holmes Makes It Right, and Holmes in New Orleans, each reinforcing the same core message. Whether it was rebuilding entire neighborhoods, responding to home emergencies, or working alongside his children, the format evolved, but the philosophy didn't. Viewers knew exactly what they were getting, and they only wanted more of it. This turned Holmes into a brand. The trust people had in him moved beyond TV and into business ventures that aligned with his image. The Holmes Group was formed to manage his expanding portfolio, which included home inspection services, educational initiatives, green building projects, and later, product lines. Unlike typical celebrity endorsements, Holmes was heavily involved in what carried his name. He insisted on quality control, often clashing with partners who wanted faster or cheaper paths to market. One of the most visible extensions of the brand came through corporate partnerships. In Canada, Holmes was repeatedly ranked among the country's most trusted public figures, a reputation that attracted major advertisers. When Nestlé Canada launched a new Nescafé product, internal polling placed Holmes at the top of their trust rankings, an unusual position for a contractor. The partnership became one of the most successful endorsement campaigns of his career and was renewed multiple times. The campaign centered around a simple idea: start your day right so it won't go wrong. It was a natural extension of Holmes's on-screen philosophy. In the commercials, Holmes appeared coffee mug in hand, delivering humorous but pointed messages about how small mistakes early on can lead to bigger problems later, a direct parallel to his construction advice. But there were two sides to this story. As Holmes's influence grew, so did expectations. Viewers didn't just see him as a TV personality, they saw him as someone who would protect them from being misled, overcharged, or put at risk. Every product, partnership, and public appearance carried the weight of that responsibility. Any misstep, even outside of television, risked undermining the very credibility his career was built on. Behind the scenes, managing that image became increasingly complex. The more Holmes expanded, the more difficult it was to ensure everything associated with his name lived up to his standards. The family crisis that changed everything. Long before Mike Holmes became a household name, his life followed a much more conventional path. In the early 1980s, Holmes married his first wife, Alexandra Lorex. Together, they built a family and had 3 children, Amanda, Sherry, and Mike Jr. At the time, Holmes was focused entirely on contracting, working long hours to provide stability in an industry that offered very little of it. But the pressure took its toll. By the early 1990s, the marriage ended in divorce, a period Holmes has described as difficult and humbling. He was trying to keep his business afloat, rebuild financially, and stay present for his children, all at the same time. By the early 2000s, just as Holmes's television career was beginning to gain traction, family once again became the center of his world, this time under far more frightening circumstances. In 2002, his daughter Sherry Holmes began experiencing persistent, severe headaches. What initially seemed manageable quickly escalated. Medical tests revealed a brain tumor roughly the size of a golf ball. The diagnosis was sudden, shocking, and left little room for delay. Within a week, Sherry underwent emergency brain surgery. At the same time, Holmes on Holmes was gaining momentum. New opportunities were opening up, and Holmes's public profile was growing rapidly. Yet almost none of this personal crisis made it into the public eye. The family chose to keep the diagnosis private, focusing on treatment and recovery rather than publicity. Thankfully, the surgery was successful, and Sherry recovered. Years later, audiences would see her confidently working alongside her father on television, with no visible trace of how close the family had come to tragedy. But the experience left a permanent mark. For Mike Holmes, it was a moment that stripped away the illusion of control. Nothing mattered when it came to his daughter's health. It was a reality he couldn't fix, manage, or outwork. The emotional impact lingered long after the crisis passed. Years later, Mike and Sherry began supporting the Megan Bebenek Foundation, an organization dedicated to pediatric brain tumor research and family support. Their involvement was understated and consistent, not tied to ratings or storylines, but rooted in shared experience. They volunteered time, raised awareness, and lent their voices to a cause that reflected a chapter of their own lives they never forgot. Despite everything that he had to face, though, by the late 2000s, Mike had built himself a legacy. He was endorsing brands. The Holmes Group was managing his growing portfolio of TV production, educational initiatives, and even environmental projects. However, in 2009, Holmes's brand started to unravel. The fans never saw it coming, but for someone as cautious as Holmes, it felt out of character. The first domino falls. One of the earliest and most visible setbacks came from Holmes's venture into publishing. In 2009, he launched Holmes, the magazine to make it right, positioning it as a practical guide for homeowners who wanted clear, reliable renovation advice. Holmes described it as the magazine he had always wanted, but could never find. Straightforward, safety-focused, and rooted in real-world experience. What could go wrong with that idea? Well, behind the scenes, however, the magazine was produced by Dauphin Media Group, not Holmes himself. While Holmes was involved in shaping some editorial direction, the business operations were handled by the publisher. That distinction became critical when the magazine folded in 2011. Dauphin Media ceased operations soon after, leaving behind unpaid vendors, unanswered subscriber refunds, and widespread frustration from readers who had paid for issues they never received. Although Holmes did not control the financial side of the magazine and did not receive the subscription money, the fallout still reflected on him. To the public, the distinction between brand and business partner was unclear. For many subscribers, Make It Right had failed to deliver, and that contradiction cut deep. Internal strain within the Holmes Group soon followed. One of the company's founding executives, Brian Quast, parted ways with the organization in 2012. While the separation was described as amicable, the leadership turnover marked a period of instability. A new CEO, Julius Brinkman, was hired shortly after, and his exit 2 years later was anything but quiet. Brinkman filed a lawsuit against Holmes and other company directors, alleging breach of contract, unpaid compensation, and a hostile working environment that hindered his ability to do his job. He claimed the company failed to pay him a percentage of funds he had helped raise and did not reimburse legitimate business expenses. Holmes never commented publicly on the lawsuit, and the case appears to have been settled privately. But the dispute exposed tensions behind the scenes of an operation that projected unity and integrity on screen. These weren't scandals in the traditional sense, but they made people question what Holmes really stood for. Every failed venture, partnership dispute, or unmet expectation carried a heavier consequence than it would for a typical television personality. The greater the chance something would fall short, even if he wasn't directly responsible. Off-camera, Make It Right became an increasingly difficult standard to uphold in a profit-driven environment. Television allowed for control and transparency. Business partnerships did not always offer the same safeguards. By the early 2010s, the cracks weren't catastrophic, but they were real. The brand that thrived on accountability was now vulnerable to the very systems it criticized. Still, Holmes persisted and tried to focus on TV, the very medium that had turned him into the figure that people loved and trusted. However, after nearly 2 decades as one of the defining faces of HGTV, Holmes made a move few longtime viewers expected. A new era for Holmes. In 2019, he officially parted ways with HGTV and signed a new deal with Bell Media, shifting his television presence to CTV and its affiliated networks. While financial terms were never disclosed, the move marked the end of an era. HGTV had been Holmes's television home since the early 2000s, and his departure quietly reshaped the network's identity just as much as it reshaped his own. Publicly, Holmes framed the move as an opportunity. He claimed that it was a chance to reach new audiences and continue spreading the Make It Right message. But behind the scenes, other forces were clearly at play. The media landscape was changing, traditional cable audiences were shrinking, and the expectations placed on legacy personalities were higher than ever. Holmes was no longer just a contractor on television. He was a brand, navigating an industry that rewarded speed, spectacle, and scale, often at the expense of precision. His newer projects reflected that shift. Shows like Holmes' Family Effect leaned more heavily into emotional storytelling and community-focused makeovers, often featuring his children in prominent roles. The focus moved away from forensic construction breakdowns and toward legacy, mentorship, and impact. For some fans, it felt like a natural evolution. For others, it felt like something essential had been lost. Among longtime viewers, reactions were mixed. Many remained fiercely loyal, viewing Holmes as a rare constant in an industry that often prioritized entertainment over safety. To them, his bluntness, repetition, and uncompromising tone were features, not flaws. Others, however, began to voice fatigue, pointing out that the very authority Holmes built his career on sometimes came across as inflexible or outdated in a rapidly evolving renovation space. Within the industry, respect for Holmes' influence remained strong. Tradespeople frequently credit him with raising awareness around building codes, permits, and consumer protection. Topics rarely discussed on television before his rise. At the same time, some contractors criticized the unrealistic expectations renovation shows created, even those built around caution. Ironically, Holmes's mission to educate sometimes collided with the limitations of television itself, and this was a complicated position to be in. The shift was a gamble, but it was also a way for Mike to show that fame hadn't changed him and that he was not going to compromise on his brand to chase success. And that gamble paid off in the long run. What is Mike Holmes up to now? Today, Mike Holmes is far less visible than he was during his HGTV peak, but he hasn't disappeared. He continues to produce television content primarily in Canada, working with Bell Media and focusing on fewer, more controlled projects rather than constant series production. His appearances are more selective, often tied to specific causes or formats rather than long-running franchises. Holmes has publicly stated that he is intentionally slowing down, stepping back from non-stop filming and prioritizing health, family, and advocacy over volume. One underreported shift in Holmes's career is that he has increasingly focused on industry standards, not entertainment. He is now heavily involved in things like promoting licensed trades, advocating for stricter building codes, and supporting homeowner education outside of television. Holmes has worked with organizations tied to skilled trades training and has repeatedly criticized how few young people are entering construction, warning of a labor shortage that could make poor workmanship even more common in the future. This is a quieter continuation of his mission, but far less glamorous than TV. And he's okay with that. The Holmes-approved Holmes program still exists, though it operates on a much smaller, more controlled scale than many fans realize. Now, builders must meet strict inspection standards, ongoing compliance checks, and licensing and insurance requirements. Unlike early expectations, the program never expanded nationwide in a major way, largely because Holmes refused to loosen standards to grow it faster. That decision limited scale, but preserved credibility. This is one of the greatest examples of the reality star choosing restraint over unsustainable growth. More than that, he remains an advocate for net-zero homes, energy efficiency, and climate-resilient construction. In recent years, Holmes has spoken less about renovation and more about future-proofing homes, especially as extreme weather events increase across North America. And all of this feels like a natural extension of his earlier work. The truth is that Mike Holmes is more comfortable being respected than popular, which explains why he chose to retreat from mainstream TV after a series of missteps that just weren't him. Financially, he is successful. His estimated net worth reflects decades of work across television, publishing, endorsements, and business ventures. Professionally, his name still carries weight, but culturally, he represents something increasingly rare, a media figure who knew the limits of his legacy. Mike Holmes didn't win in the traditional sense, but he hasn't lost either. What do you think of his complicated journey? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.